All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Flameside Chat here at Center College. I'm your host, Jamie Powell, and tonight's discussion is going to be about that little thing that happened yesterday that everybody's been talking about some today, and that is the 2014 midterm elections. So to get this discussion going with us tonight, we have three of Center's political science faculty. And I'm going to briefly introduce them before I turn it over to them to start tossing around some discussion about yesterday's election. First, we've got Dr. Dan Stroop. He is the Pierce and Amelia Harrington Lively Professor of Politics and Law. He's also the pre-law advisor and the chair of the politics program. Dr. Stroop has been with Center since 1976. His areas of expertise and research interests encompass American political history, the judicial process, the legislative process, and the civil rights movement in America. Also with us tonight, we have Dr. Benjamin Knoll. He's an assistant professor of politics. He came to Center in 2010 and was named a Center Scholar in 2013. His area of expertise is in American politics with a specialization in public opinion and voting behavior, specifically race and politics, religion and politics, and political psychology. That's a good one. And finally, Dr. Leah Rohr. She joined Center in 2013 as a visiting assistant professor of politics. Leah's research interests include American politics and politics and gender, campaigns and elections, and politics and the media. So before I turn it over to these three to start discussion, I want to remind everyone that we want these chats to be interactive, so please, please, please comment in the YouTube comments or tweet your questions to #Flameside, all one word. All right, let's turn it over and get some discussion started. So this thing that happened yesterday is midterm elections. Let's talk about it.
All right. So yes, I'm Dr. Benjamin Knoll. What we've talked about is I think we've each got a couple of things that we'd like to say for the first couple of minutes to toss out some interesting observations that we had about the election results and such. And then after those brief comments, then open it up to questions and input from the individuals here. So there was a big election yesterday, as we talked about. It's a midterm election, and so we have 2 years since the president's last election, and then all 435 seats in the House of Representatives were up, plus a third of the Senate. And by now, most people who've seen the headlines could see what occurred. It was a bad day for the Democratic Party. We had a change in the leadership in the Senate, or what will become so in January. The House of Representatives, no big change. The Republicans picked up a couple of seats, but that will stay in Republican hands as well. And then earlier today, we had President Obama coming out to talk about that, to put some interpretation, his perspective on it. We also had the incoming Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell from our state of Kentucky here talking about what that's going to be like. And so there's all sorts of speculation. There's all sorts of things that have been in the media the last 24 hours, putting interpretations on that. And so I think part of our objective is to give our interpretations of this event, the results, and what happened here. So there's just a couple of points that I wanted to make up. One of them is, first and foremost, the results that we saw yesterday, to some extent, what I think is remarkable about this midterm election is the extent to which it was a fairly, we could call a normal midterm election. There's a couple of patterns, historically speaking, that become evident when we look at election results over the last half century or so. And one of those is that the president's party almost always loses seats in Congress in midterm elections. There's been a couple of exceptions to that, but the vast majority, that's simply expected to happen. And so just based on historical precedent, it would be a very, very rare thing indeed for the Democrats to have done anything but lose at least a couple of seats in the election yesterday. So it wasn't a question so much as whether or not the Democrats were going to lose seats, but simply how many were they going to lose. Was it going to be enough to flip control of the Senate, for instance? And then something else that's also very important in predicting outcomes of congressional elections or midterm elections is how popular the president is in the country. And I think it's no secret, President Obama, last I checked, aggregation of job approval polls puts him somewhere at 42, 43% there. So a midterm election plus a 42% approval rating on the part of the Democratic president does not spell well for Democrats in Congress. So just based on that, what we saw happen yesterday was very much in line with what we would have expected to happen. Not knowing anything about the election, none of the campaign ads, any of the debates any of the candidates had, just simply knowing those 2 bits of information provided boundaries with which we would expect the results to happen. There were, at the political science conference I attended back in the spring, there were a number of people who make it their job to try to figure out like how much each of these things matter in predicting outcomes and such. And there was a panel, and they put all these together and aggregated them to give an average level of predictions. And so I took this and I talked about it with my campaigns and elections class. And they were predicting, based on the fact that it's a midterm election and the president's approval rating at the time, that the Democrats would probably lose somewhere around 14 to 15 seats in the House and somewhere between 5 and 6 seats in the Senate. And that was 6 months ago, before most of the things that have been happening, in the last couple of months, all the campaign ads that we've seen. And then we see last night that, if anything, they're a little bit conservative in those estimates. There's a couple of Senate seats that are still up near 3, I think. But at this point, the Republicans have picked up at least 7 seats in the Senate, and it's looking like 10 seats in the House, and there's about 15 to 20 they're still trying to get final results, and so that's still up in the air. But just seeing that, I think, helps us understand the role of these different factors in predicting election outcomes. And so from that perspective, I thought that was something worth remarking upon. The second point is that a lot of the media narrative that we're seeing today is about the extent to which that this is a referendum on President Obama. The electorate is indicating that they're not happy with his policies or what the case may be. And fair enough with some of that narrative. In terms of that goes very much in line with the political science explanation that the president's party usually loses seats during midterm elections. But the question, I guess, that's interesting to me is, to what extent is this referendum on President Obama any more or less than any other referendum in any other midterm election that's happened for the last half century or so? It's not unfair to say that every midterm election is a referendum on the sitting president, because every midterm election, just about, the president's party loses seats. Historically speaking, even though last night was a bad night for Democrats, put in context, during the second term of a president who serves 2 terms, the average seat loss for his party is 31 seats in the House of Representatives, and so far it's looking closer to 14 to 15 seat loss there. So in historical context, that referendum against President Obama isn't near as large as some others have been throughout history. So I think that's an important thing to consider as well. And then the third point I want to make, and I'll be done with this because I've talked long enough here, is that the Democratic Party definitely lost big last night. Governorships in the House and the Senate and such, but there were also a number of other ballot initiatives on political policies that were on the ballot last night as well. And with few exceptions, they turned out very well for liberals and Democrats on those. We had marijuana legalization in Washington, D.C. and Oregon, minimum wage increases in states like Arkansas and Nebraska, very, very red states. And Washington had an expansion on background checks on guns and all these sorts of things. So the electorate, if anything, indicated that they're displeased with the Democrats as a party, but still endorsing many of the Democratic policy priorities, which just goes to show the ambivalence sometimes of an electorate and the difficulty in trying to say that the electorate and the American people were sending a clear message one way or the other about their preferences. Like so many things in American politics, it's really difficult sometimes to discern what a clear message that the electorate's trying to send. Sometimes they're sending 2 simultaneous messages at once, if not more. So that's what I have to say, and I'll pass this on to Dr. Rohr.
Okay, so I just want to make a few statements about some of the gender change happening in the election. So every election cycle, we see a few more women gaining office, steadily climbing. And now, for the first time, we're going to have that number in triple digits. So we're going to have at least 100 women in Congress. Of course, in the past, a lot of those gains have been among Democrats. So this year, Republican women really did make a lot of firsts. And so I'm just going to read a list of a few that I noted. So Mia Love, first Black Republican elected to Congress from Utah. Gina Raimondo is the first female governor of Rhode Island. And we have Joni Ernst, first female veteran in the U.S. Senate, another Republican. Shelley Moore Capito, first female senator from West Virginia. Mara Healey, first openly gay state's attorney general. Elise Stefanik, first 30-year-old woman in Congress. And so we can see that we have seen a steady increase on the Republican side as far as women go. And just want to make another note about the gender gap. So some of these elections, we often think that women are going to be the ones who are going to be driving these female or even Democratic candidates into office. But really, we've seen a big gender gap, but it's been more driven by men. Men specifically overwhelmingly voting for the Republican candidates, as opposed to the women being more balanced as far as who they're voting for.
Okay. Well, we drew straws, and I get to make the predictions about what this means, so I'm not accountable for any of this in the long run. First of all, there's the obvious. In January, all of the committee chairs in the Senate will be Republicans. Republicans will control the agenda. They'll control the timing of legislation in a way that did not before. This is going to mean, for one thing, I think it is going to make it very difficult for the president to get appointments made. And we could see a lot of interim appointments made, deputy or acting officers filling the ranks of government. What comes in terms of a legislative product, it seems to me, is going to depend on what people make of this, what the people in office make of it. We've had conflicting messages, I think, from both the president and the new majority leader. Last night, Senator McConnell gave a speech that had conciliatory moments, had moments where he said that just because we have a two-party system, we don't need to think that we have to be in perpetual conflict. And at the same time, he was talking about turning the country around and ending the experiment in big government. The president, for his part, talked about working with the Republicans and even listed an agenda of items where he thought that they could work together. A jobs program, infrastructure development, tax reform, trade, early childhood education. He even talked about the minimum wage. Whether those are in fact programs on which they do share enough common ground to legislate, I think, is another matter. The Republicans have a majority in the Senate. They do not have, certainly do not have the kind of majority that would allow them to override a veto, nor do they have a majority that would, without Democratic help, allow them to overcome a filibuster. One possibility will be then that Republicans will try to get an agenda through by attaching riders to budget legislation or by defunding programs through budget legislation. The point about budget legislation is that given the peculiar rules of the Senate, a simple majority is enough to pass legislation. So it is possible that they could attempt to legislate through the budget process and send lots and lots of legislation to the president, forcing him either to sign them or to bring the government down by vetoing budget bills. Certainly there are those who are advocating that within the Republican Party. Rand Paul last night, in introducing Senator McConnell, suggested that the Senate was going to send lots and lots of legislation to the president's desk. We can talk about this later, but I think there are probably pressures both ways. There are pressures on the Republicans to work with the president, and there are competing pressures for them not to cooperate with the president. So how's that for a prediction? I don't know.
Okay, thank you all for your comments, and let's open the floor to some questions now. We do have one question that's come in on the YouTube feed from Nick Jones, and I'm gonna show it to you, but I'll also read it. How were the polls so wrong about Grimes? I realize they showed McConnell's campaign gaining strength as it got closer to Election Day, but nothing foreshadowing such a blowout, 15 points. Was it simply a matter of failure to account for turnout enthusiasm along the ideological spectrum, or was something else at play?
I think part of it would have been turnout if the base voting programs didn't turn out as much. But I also think that, I mean, from the Republican standpoint, they were really good the last couple of days of getting on the ground and really getting their voters out, as well as launching a lot of ads that really were targeted on that. So I think that Republicans might have just been better organized.
It's interesting to see, too, that this wasn't a phenomenon only in Kentucky.
Yeah.
This happened in lots of Senate races, which all were fairly accurate in predicting who would win, but underestimating the margin of victory for each of these here. And so so I would say it's not just something that's localized only to Kentucky, but it's part of a larger systemic kind of thing, whatever the explanation would be there.
Yeah, I'm thinking Michelle Nunn, you had a similar big gap, whereas we thought that would be a really close election as well.
So, Ben, can you talk a little bit about some of the research that you do with your students, especially regarding the exit polls? I do have a question here that came in on the Twitter feed asking if you had any exit poll numbers and how those results jived with the actual results that occurred. Can you tell us anything about that?
Sure, we could do that. So that's one of the projects that we've been doing here at Center College since 2011. I came here in 2010, and I teach classes on public opinion and voting and elections and such. And so I thought that this would be something that would be serve a couple of different purposes. And first and foremost, this is a project that's an excellent educational experience for the students. What we do is we put together a set of survey questions in anticipation of the questions, and most of them come from me, but the students have input in those questions there. And then we print up the surveys. We get students to be at each of the voting locations throughout Boyle County. They're at every precinct from the time the polls open till the time the polls close. And they're distributing surveys to all the people who come through in Boyle County. And we've had really good participation on the part of the voters of Boyle County, who are generally fairly enthusiastic to participate, and so that's been great. We've had an increasing number of responses each year that we've been doing this. The second purpose, in addition to being a great active experiential learning opportunity for students, is that it provides a service to the community as well here in Boyle County, because we have a number of questions that look at asking opinions about the performance of local elected officials, about policies, compete priorities and this kind of thing, and that information then we make available to the community for whoever wants it, and they can do with it whatever they want. But that's something that we can provide as a service that both helps the students as well as helps the community. And the third purpose it serves is that of a research purpose as well. There are a number of research projects that I have that I've been able to collect data on through these surveys that then make their way into papers. There was a paper that we were able to get published just last year that used data collected from the very first exit poll we did in 2011. The one we did in 2012, I was able to use some of the results there, put it into a paper that was presented at a conference last year, and that's been sent out to go through the rigorous peer review process. And then we also had, this time, questions for student research projects on the poll that we put out yesterday. Students in my Parties, Campaigns, and Elections class, they're doing a series of research projects looking at the question of split ticket voting in Kentucky, because we have here in Kentucky a really interesting opportunity to study this phenomenon, because Kentucky is different in a lot of ways than the rest of the country. Most everywhere else in the country we have a fairly predictable set of voter behavior. Republicans vote for fellow Republicans, Democrats vote for fellow Democrats. But here in Kentucky we have an interesting case where many self-identified Democrats will vote for Democrats for local and state elections, but then Republicans at the congressional and presidential level. And so one of these research groups wrote a couple of questions to test some specific hypotheses about why voters engage in this in split-ticking behavior. And so that was fielded. We're getting the data set together, and they're going to be analyzing that data themselves and then presenting it in the spring at the Kentucky Political Science Association conference. So this project has lots of different purposes and gets across lots of different advantages and benefits, both for the students, for ourselves, and as well as the community. In terms of results, we can see it's up on the up on my blog. It'll be published in the Danville paper probably in the next couple of days. But I can say there was a couple of trends that we saw. One of the overriding trends was that the Boyle County voters seemed fairly optimistic about how things are going here in Boyle County. They said, generally speaking, about 3/4 of them said that things are going in the right track as opposed to off on the wrong track. They generally approve of the local elected officials and their stewardship over a number of issues that they've been dealing with in the last year or two. And another interesting thing that we were able to see was that there was a mayoral election here in Danville yesterday. And there were some interesting trends that came out of voting patterns for the two different candidates. In Danville, we have nonpartisan elections, and so no one runs with a party label. There aren't Democrats and Republicans. But at the same time, we tend to see moderate levels of partisan patterns in predicting voting for those particular candidates. And so there was one candidate who drew a lot of support from more older conservative voters who tended to identify more as Republican, and then another candidate who drew more support from younger, self-identified, more liberal, more Democratic-leaning candidates. And it wasn't a one-to-one relationship. It wasn't every Republican voter voted for this mayoral candidate. But there was an interesting moderate-level relationship there. And that's something we wouldn't be able to know without that exit poll there. And so that's one of the things that we're able to provide for the community, just to know what kinds of patterns influence voting behaviors here at the local level in the town that we live in.
Okay. We've got another question that's come in on the Twitter feed from Greg Brooks. He asks, do you think McConnell will reverse the nuclear option in the Senate?
Hey, Greg. I'm not sure. I think that all the talk when the Democrats were doing it was that they were going to regret that they had done it. I think they could possibly will. I mean, I think it's going to be very difficult for, even with a 51 simple majority vote for approving of nominees. I think it's going to be difficult for Obama to get his nominations through, and I think particularly judicial nominations are going to be difficult. That would be my thought.
Yeah. With Greg, I assume you're talking about the nuclear option being the change to the filibuster to reduce it to a 50-vote majority for non-Supreme Court judicial nominations, and not like for legislation or Supreme Court justices, because that nuclear button hasn't been pushed yet. It might be coming, but it hasn't happened quite yet. My guess would be, and it's just a guess, that now that McConnell has the majority there's no reason to take away power that he now has.
Yeah.
So my strong hunch would be that he's going to go full speed ahead, keeping that particular rule in place. But then probably nothing else will happen on that unless 2016 comes along. Maybe we have a Republican president. The Republicans perhaps keep the Senate and have the House, and the only thing that's stopping the Republican Party from basically doing whatever they want with the government is that filibuster in the Senate. Then we might hear talk once again of the nuclear option going full speed ahead in the Senate. But until then, I'm not sure how likely that would be.
So there would be.
Okay, we have another question here that's come in on the YouTube feed. It is from our own Bo Weston. It seems to me that the Tea Party is not part of the Republican Party, but a very uneasy coalition partner. Now that the Republicans will lead both houses of Congress, I wonder if they will have a harder time trying to govern because the Tea Party will be even more opposed to any compromise with the president. I guess it's more like a comment, but you can treat that last line like a question. Do you think the Tea Party will be even more opposed to any compromise with the president?
This gets a little bit at the question I was thinking about earlier. The Republicans are going to be drawn in two different directions, it seems to me, on the question of cooperation with the president. On the one hand, there is the Tea Party influence. There are new Tea Party people who have been elected, Cotton in Arkansas, for example. And there are going to be probably 4 or 5 presidential aspirants in the Republican Party, 2 of whom at least, 3 of whom at least, Rand Paul, Ted Cruz, Rubio, are all of one flavor or another Tea Party affiliates. They are, I think, going to want not to cooperate with the president. I don't see Ted Cruz going along with a lot of cooperation with the president. On the other hand, the Republicans in 2016 are going to have to defend 24 Senate seats. Several of those are in states that have, in the last 2 elections, voted for Obama. So they're defending, it's sort of the reverse for the Republicans of the situation that Ben was describing that the Democrats face this time. I think that many of those Republicans facing re-election may want to be able to take some positive results back to the voters next fall. I think the Republicans are going to have some pressure to demonstrate to America that they can govern too. They have been tagged by many pundits with being the party of no, and I think that there are definitely some pressures on them to come around and try to work with the president.
Yeah, I mean, I think the difficulty is that there isn't really a cohesive agenda aside from opposing Obama, and so once they're actually in office and need to institute legislation, are they going to be able to come together, the moderates and Tea Party Republicans? So I guess we'll have to wait and see on that one.
Well, and there was not in this election, as there have been in some other elections. There's nothing the equivalent of the '94 contract with America. There was, in fact, this was an issueless election. There was not any kind of position stand other than trying to attach Democratic candidates to Obama, and the Democrats, for their part, did very little other than to try to tell the voters that I'm not Obama. And so to talk about a mandate coming out of this election seems to me to be totally impossible.
Yeah, and the whole idea, like the media talks a lot about a mandate. Politicians often claim mandates after elections for support of their policies. This is something we talked about in our campaigns and elections class. The theory of a mandate also presumes that voters have very clear preferences on a host of issues, and that they're able to translate those preferences very logically into the particular candidates who then support those particular things, and in a semi-unified fashion vote in accordance with those preferences that they clearly have on these particular issues, and then send a message that way. And each of those claims just has a really hard time holding up to empirical evidence on this. Most people don't really have that clear or strong of opinions or firm preferences on a number of issues, and oftentimes they're fairly variable as well. Oftentimes people's preferences are as much a reaction to who's ever president or governing at the time as they are bringing it about in the first place. And so getting back to this point here, it's often claimed and we often talk about it, but it's tough to say that. Just like we were talking about before, we elected a lot of Republicans to Congress, but then voted a lot of ballot initiatives that the Republicans themselves probably don't support. You know, what is the American public thinking? We have a small amount of ambivalence, we could say, on a number of issues.
Yeah, that's what's most striking to me is the minimum wage initiatives that basically all overwhelmingly voted in favor of raising minimum wage, while also voting in candidates that were opposed to minimum wage.
All of them in red states.
So
that Arkansas elects a Tea Party senator by a 2-to-1 margin, and at the same time passes a minimum wage law by a 2-to-1 margin. One other thing it seems to me that could play into this whole business of whether the Republicans want to work with the president or not is the phenomenon that our political parties, our elections, not only have rather deeply divided us, but very closely divided us. And the problem with that is, or a result of that is that we've seen the Democrats in 2006, now the danger that I think the Republicans in 2014 might see themselves as one election away from having the whole game. And because they've won the House, they've won the Senate, one more election and they can have it all. And if you have if you can have it all, you don't have to compromise. There's no particular incentive to compromise. And I think that's a problem. Again, I think the counterweight to that is, though, that the Republicans are going to want to be able to go to the electorate in 2016 with some product, something that they have produced, especially after the reputation of the 113th Congress as the do absolutely nothing Congress.
Indeed.
Yeah, one might argue that voters were not just responding to maybe not liking Obama as much, but also toward Congress in general. And so if voters don't see things happening, they're going to vote against whoever's in office. And so, I mean, this is a good opportunity for Republicans to maybe cooperate a little bit more, or perhaps continue what they're doing. And hard to say.
Right, and then just building on these points here, the fundamental reality of the constituencies in each of these districts and states where the Republicans were elected from haven't shifted all that much. The same primary constituencies that elected the fairly extreme, either liberal or conservative members of Congress haven't suddenly become a lot more moderate or shifted in their partisan preferences. If these politicians, once elected, all of a sudden start veering toward the middle and compromising all over the place, there's a primary challenger just waiting for them, either 2 or however many years to the next Senate election is there. And so that fundamental reality constrains the behavior of these individuals to be able to create bipartisan compromises, or to be able to veer toward the middle or find the common ground on a lot of things. Because America simply we don't have a common understanding of what the common good is. We have varying competing versions of what is best for our country. And we live in different places where those different realities just tend to prevail. And until that fundamental reality changes, it's really difficult for the people who represent those areas to do anything other than continue to represent their constituents who want a particular type of policy being represented.
Okay, let's shift gears just a little bit with another kind of question. Let's talk about one of those things that we all know and love: political ads, commercials. Especially, let's talk about some that have been particularly noteworthy this season. Joni Ertz's ad about castrating pigs comes to mind. There was Allison Lundergan Grimes' skeet shooting. First, let's do like a 2-part question. First, let's talk about, do we have any idea how much money was spent on political ads this season? How effective you think those ads are? And then maybe comment a little bit on the fact that the 2 most memorable were women candidates really trying to say something strongly in those ads.
I don't have a number on how much. I just noted earlier today there's some estimate that it's almost $4 billion that was spent on elections total. I don't know how much of that was television advertising, but by any measure, that's a good chunk of money.
Did I hear 100 million, close to 100 million spent in Kentucky alone?
That wouldn't surprise me.
There's enough to buy every citizen a bottle of bourbon. There's some kind of statistic there. But I think from a gender, that if women, ran as women and ran stereotypically feminine, that they would win. But I think we've seen the last couple election cycles that the women who played gender beliefs actually have done the best. And at least Lundergan Grimes, from my perspective, someone who studies how politicians run and how they present their gender, that she almost sent mixed signals. I mean, she started off her campaign starting with a folksy ad where she's with her grandmothers and was almost appealing to that stereotypically feminine aspect. And then she goes off on another tangent with the shooting and the clay pigeons, and it seemed like she was almost confused as to what kind of message she was sending.
Oh, I think the message was very clear in both cases. She wanted both of those messages to get across. You all would be much better at this to comment on, but to me it's one. I think it's a result of the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United that the floodgates are just open to spending money, and from a sort of political philosophy point of view, it is very disappointing to see the kind of political dialogue that results from that degree of spending. Again, all of the money that we've talked, record amounts of money being spent to deliver no message whatsoever of substance. And so it would have been nice, I think. It would have been informative more than nice. It would have been informative. It would have been a real exercise in democracy if we had had a genuine debate about questions like, what do you mean when you say you want to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act? What would we replace it with? From the other side, what do you mean when you say you want to amend it, you want to fix it? What about it do you want to fix? It would have been informative if we could have had a real debate about immigration, if we could have talked about issues and voters could have felt that at least their concerns were being discussed, and the elections would have had this informative role. The money was spent essentially on image, and the primary image being one of affiliation or non-affiliation with the president. And so the result, of course, is that neither party, had the Democrats won, they would have no more been able to claim any kind of mandate than I think the Republicans can right now. Nobody can really claim that the voters endorsed much of anything. I think the message that the voters sent was that they're really not very happy with the government as it's not working now, and that they wanted to do something. The exit polls showed that disapproval rates of 54% for the Democratic Party, 54%, exact same figure, 54% disapproval for the Republican Party. Voters aren't very happy right now.
I almost wonder if attack ads actually have increased, though. I don't know if you have the data for that, but my hunch is that it would, because all this money is being used to fund negative campaigning.
Right. Well, that's an interesting question on this, because it certainly seems like it's gotten a whole lot worse in recent memory. Sometimes I show for fun my students, show them some of the attack ads of the election of 1800 in terms of the essays that were being written about Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and the kind of things that they said about each other at the time. And so one of the things that we emphasize is that attack ads are nothing new in American politics. So we have a long and glorious tradition of sensationalistic kind of advertising and such. I suppose that the silver lining we could think about with campaign ads is the extent to which, so we all look at them and we don't like them very much, and we all we can agree that it's not very good from a perspective of deliberative democracy or having a good tangible discussion about issues. Researchers who have tried to figure out if negative ads change people's minds in terms of who they're going to vote for or affect widely outcomes of elections so far haven't been able to uncover much evidence, though, that there's all sorts of people who are being swayed left and right, who are changing their political partisanship or who they're going to vote for on a daily basis because of the latest ad that they saw, things like that. Most people are pretty secure in their partisanship and their preferences, and oftentimes negative ads serve to reinforce existing preferences rather than persuade people one way or the other. And so oftentimes we spend a lot of money on ads and they're there, but evidence that, for example, the McConnell won the election because of negative ads or negative mailers, that's a lot harder to come by. There's a lot bigger factors that drive election outcomes than TV ads that we see.
Okay, let me ask this question though. Do negative ads erode faith that people have in the system? Erode? I mean, I've got this again. This is from the exit polls. Which comes closest to your feelings about the Obama administration? Enthusiastic, satisfied but not enthusiastic, dissatisfied but not angry, angry. 27% of the voters yesterday recorded that they were angry about the Obama administration. Which comes closest to your feelings about Republican leaders in Congress? Same choices. 23% of the voters yesterday said that they were angry about the congressional leaders. Do negative ads feed that kind of distrust in government, anger at government?
Yeah, so that's a great question too. So that's a separate question from determining outcomes of elections or swaying people on this. And other people have looked at that very thing there. And there's different ways that they go about trying to do it. Running surveys in an area after a lot of negative ads have come through, asking questions about trust in government, how much political efficacy, like belief that you are able to influence the system and such. And different studies will show different things, but on average, it's coming out of kind of a wash over the last couple of years. There's no really clear evidence one way or the other that they're really drastically changing one way or the other. It seems like, well, there's a researcher, I think at the University of Maryland, his name's John Green. He kind of says it like this. He says that negative ads are kind of like eating your spinach. He says that no one likes them, and everyone agrees that spinach is kind of gross. Sorry, spinach lovers out there. But he says at the same time in his research, he finds that negative ads, to be fair, are filled with a lot more information than positive ads are. Now that information is often presented in a slanted way or something, but if you just count up the bits of factual information that are portrayed, he says positive ads are great, but oftentimes they're focusing, isn't this candidate have a nice family? Look, there's the flag with them. What a great person. Whereas the negative ads oftentimes will say, this vote happened this way, this person was not supporting this particular issue on this particular measure, this candidate was opposed to it, and so he makes an argument that at least ads, even if we don't like them, can also put information out into the environment that otherwise wouldn't be there. So at least he doesn't see this as overly problematic for American politics, but rather one of the necessary, definitely not desirable things, but at the same time perhaps not doing as much damage as we often think is being done by them.
But I would think if you're just putting out negative information and there isn't going to be any good positive information, that would slowly chip away, although I don't know how you can really capture that. I mean, people do have less trust in Congress, but how much of that can be attributed to ads?
Right. I guess we could do like Mexico. It was a couple of years ago, they put a law in place saying that presidential campaign candidates could only run positive ads. And so they just made negative ads.
That would be an interesting experiment.
We might have a First Amendment issue.
I would think you would have a
But that's one solution that's been brought up in the world to try to deal with this.
Okay, we've got another question here from Greg Brooks about the impact of low voter turnout this year. His question is, will the 2016 Democrats be able to bring out Obama's voting coalition?
For 2016?
Yeah, I mean, historically, the turnout, the kinds of people who are likely to vote Democratic, given the current demographics, are the people less likely to turn out. And so if you compare the turnouts in the exit polls from 2012 with the exit polls for this year, you'll see that the electorate in 2012 was, well, the electorate in 2014, we'll do it this way, the electorate in 2014 was more white, more male, older, wealthier, better educated, and on each of those categories, the Democrats were hurt because of that decline in turnout. A presidential election seems to bring out more of those people. More people turn out to vote. Whether they'll be able to put together the entire coalition is another question. I saw a projection that given the change in demographics, a Republican candidate running in 2016, presidential candidate, if the Republicans got the same share of votes that they got in 2012, they did not expand outreach to other groups, a Republican candidate would have to get 63% of the white vote in order to be elected. Now, Ronald Reagan got 64% of the white vote in 1984, but that was, the greatest landslide election in American history. And so I think that there are certainly causes for concern on the part of both parties in the election results last night. Certainly in the exit polling results, I think there are questions.
Mm-hmm. So demographic coalitions is one question. I guess we could look at it from another perspective. Is a 2016 candidates likely to bring out as many voters as in 2008 or 2012? And I'd say probably. Obama in 2008 didn't get that many more. So the 2008 election didn't have a voter turnout historically that much higher than the previous elections. It goes around the margins, a couple of percentage points here and there. But historically speaking, for the last 50 years or so, we've had somewhere around 65% of the American electorate turning out in presidential elections in a fairly predictable pattern. I don't see any reason to think that 2016 would be much different. In terms of the amount of people who show up to vote, which groups of people, well, that's a separate question. But I don't see any cause to think that we'll have a sudden dip in voter turnout in 2016 or increase relative to what we've had the last several elections.
Okay, got another question here that's come in on the YouTube feed from Nick Jones. You mentioned the equal dissatisfaction with the two major parties. But another election has come and gone with no real success for a third party or independent candidates. Do you see that ever changing? And then also, what responsibility should the media have to provide attention to third-party candidates? And he lists an example of that, how KET excluded the Libertarian candidate from the U.S. Senate debate.
Is that our classic institution question?
Yeah. I guess I would say that the whole primary process has probably taken a lot of the wind out of third parties. They contest within the primary system, so that as Bo called in and noted, the Tea Party became sort of a wing of the Republican Party, even though they're not really Republicans. It reminds me a lot of, in another day, of what the populists became in the 1890s. Very similar sort of split. They, however, they broke off and became their own party. I don't see that happening much. I think the primary system really kind of works against third-party candidates.
I think also that the two major parties are pretty good about absorbing the third-party demands into their larger platform, especially if you think about things like Tea Party or even Libertarian demands being absorbed into the Republican platform and history, with the Democratic Party in the same way when it comes to maybe some Green Party demands.
Right, and a lot of this has to do with the way our electoral systems are designed in the United States. Unlike many other countries around the world, where there is a consolation prize for second or third or fourth place, where seats in the legislature are allocated proportionally to the percentage of votes they get. We don't have anything like that in the United States. It's winner take all. We have a single member district, winner take all elections, which incentivizes, just as Dan and Leo were saying, the parties to absorb any third party threats, but also incentivizes us to never vote for a third party because there's no consolation prize for second place.
It's a wasted vote.
Exactly. So until our Constitution changes, until we change our method of election, third parties are probably not going to be overly successful in our system.
And the costs running for office also militate against third-party candidates. It's just really difficult to amass the kind of money. Not impossible. We have two independents in the United States Senate. We have an independent who gave a close run in a race in Kansas. It's not impossible, but it is really difficult to mount that kind of money to run a campaign.
Okay, I have another question here. So the Democratic candidates largely tried to distance themselves from Obama, but several of them embraced Bill and/or Hillary Clinton, including Pryor, who lost the governor's race in Arkansas by a wide margin. Any comments on the Clinton effect?
I guess that would assume that there's such a... Okay, so the question is, to what extent do political endorsements affect election outcomes? And like many other things that we've seen, there's a couple of big things that affect election outcomes that we've discussed, whether it's a presidential year or midterm year, level of presidential approval, and especially how the economy is doing. After we take into account those effects, these other things matter, but to a much, 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 much smaller effect. I would say any Clinton effect, if existent, is very, very small, at least in terms of determining the election outcome. So that's what I would say about that.
Yeah, I would say it almost seems like the media wants there to be a Clinton effect. That's why we're hearing so much about it. But in reality, probably didn't make that much of a difference.
Might also have been an opportunity for Hillary to get out and get out, have some FaceTime with the public and get some publicity for her possible presidential run in 2016.
Yes, the question we ask ourselves is just do a thought experiment. Let's say you are a Republican voter. Are you going to be any more or less likely to vote or not vote for the Republican candidate because Bill or Hillary Clinton come to the state? Or if you're a Democrat, are you going to be any more or less likely to vote for your candidate because Bill or Hillary Clinton did or did not come? That might matter for some people, but most people it probably doesn't that much, and therefore the effect is somewhat muted.
I almost feel like as far as mobilization goes, the people that they would mobilize are the ones that tend to vote anyway. I would think the older generation would be more likely to be mobilized by the Clinton effect anyway.
And just a question of curiosity. I think that Democrats are going to vote very consistently Democratic, and that correlation has tightened up over the last many years. Also, the correlation between ideology and party has tightened up. So that the kind of folks that you might be aiming that kind of appeal at, the kind of folks who might have, that it might have an effect on, would be independents. And I'm just curious here, this is again from the exit poll yesterday, 36% of the people who voted yesterday designated themselves as Democrats, 36% as Republicans, 28% designated themselves as independents. And so, there's a chunk of people out there who are to be persuaded. Also by ideology, 23% of the people who voted yesterday designated themselves liberal, 37% conservative, and 40% moderate. And I guess that's a question here too. Then, who are the moderates really, and the independents? Are they the folks who are really determining the elections? And what sways their vote?
Right. Well, on that one, that's an interesting question too. When those surveys ask people their partisanship, they just ask them a 3-point question, right? It's like, do you consider yourself a Democrat or a Republican or an independent? Some surveys, though, push it a little bit further, and if they say they're an independent, they ask a follow-up question. They ask, well, okay, you're an independent, but do you tend to lean more toward the Republican Party or more toward the Democratic Party? And oftentimes it's the case that those who are independents but say they lean toward the party are virtually indistinguishable in their opinions and their voter behavior than the ones who say they're partisans in the first place. After you subtract them from the equation, we're left with about 10 to 15% of the electorate who are straight-line pure independents. But then at the same time, those are the people also least likely often to show up to vote. They're also least knowledgeable. George Bush and Karl Rove kind of figured this out in 2004, where they were kind of the first to adopt the let's motivate, drive, turn out the base, because those independent voters are probably not going to show up, so we might be more effective on this end. That being said, not everyone in that 15% falls into that category, and those are the types of people who would perhaps be more amenable to this kind of persuasion, mobilization effect by people coming.
And I have seen figures about sort of a new independent. That the assumption was always that the independents were the people in the middle, and there is emerging. I think this speaks to the Tea Party question we had earlier. That there is this new independent who is not uncomfortable with the Republican Party because it's too far to the right, and but the Democrats are too far to the left. They're upset with the Republican Party because it's not far enough to the right, and so they. I think there are people who do identify themselves as Tea Party affiliates and do not identify themselves as Republicans, and so whether that, all we have is self-designation as independent. It doesn't tell us where along the political spectrum they see their independence.
A very, very motley crew.
Just want to let you know, Dr. Rohr, that your comment about the money spent on political advertising would be enough to purchase each Kentuckian a bottle of bourbon has really caught on Twitter. Does anyone have a comment on the Bourbon Summit?
I'll get a bottle of bourbon in the mail.
This is about President Obama today. I think Center would be a great site to host it. What do you guys think?
Pardon?
I think Center would be a great place to host the Bourbon Summit.
Oh,
the Bourbon Summit, exactly.
All right, well, we're almost out of time, so I'm going to let each of you kind of give like a quick little wrap-up sentence or two before we close. But before that, I do want to mention that we're going to have this broadcast available on the Center Alumni YouTube channel, and that we will be posting follow-up information on Facebook and Twitter. And I also want to let everybody know that we're going to take a break in December with the Flameside chats, but we're going to be back in January with our very own President John Roush talking about a little thing called leadership, which is kind of appropriate with what we've been talking about today. So with that, I'll turn it over to you guys for some final thoughts.
I'll go. It seems to me that the message that was sent by yesterday's election was one of real dissatisfaction with the government and with its failure to address serious problems that the American people feel they are facing. That message, at least both Senator McConnell and the President said they got that message yesterday. I do have hopes. It is, yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd go along with that. I'm not sure that there really is one takeaway message I would get from either camp, or that there is any kind of clear mandate. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see a lot of the same that we've seen in the past 2 years, a lot of the same type of politics.
I guess I'll close saying that in contrast to presidential elections, midterm elections tend to barely break 40% usually. We have less than half of the eligible Americans showing up to vote. By all estimates I've seen so far, this election is not going to be all that much different. So just remember, you don't vote, you don't get to complain.
And on that note, we will end our Flameside discussion. I'd like to thank Drs. Knoll, Rohr, and Stroop for joining us today. And again, be sure to check back with us in January when we have another Flameside chat. Until then, everybody have a great evening.
Thank you.